And it's at this point in our story that the subject of our episode comes into play. You see, I recently learned that the name of the first ever known nuclear test conducted on Earth was the Trinity test. You see, on June 18th, 1942, which is actually the same day that Winston Churchill arrived in Washington, D.C. to meet with President Roosevelt. And interestingly enough, before he left for that meeting, he actually sent a letter to the king telling him who he wanted him to name as prime minister if Winston Churchill did not make it back alive from that trip. Now, on that very same day, the US officially started the Manhattan Project. And that ultimately, as I said, leads to the creation of the nuclear weapons that were detonated just over 3 years later um, on July 16th, 1945, at the Trinity test. And it's here that I want to turn to an article from the US Department of Energy to describe the test and the blast it produced. Quote, the world's first nuclear explosion occurred on July 16th, 1945, when a plutonium implosion device was tested at a site located 210 miles south of Los Alamos, New Mexico, on the barren plains of the Alamogordo bombing range, known as the Jornada del Muerto, inspired by the poetry of John Donne. J. Robert Oppenheimer codenamed the test Trinity. Hoisted atop a 100-foot tower, the plutonium device, or gadget, detonated at precisely 5:30 a.m. over the New Mexico desert, releasing 18.6 kilotons of power, instantly vaporizing the tower and turning the surrounding asphalt and sand into green glass. Seconds after the explosion came an enormous blast, sending searing heat across the desert and knocking observers to the ground. The success of the Trinity test meant that an atomic bomb using plutonium could be readied for the use by the U.S. military. Now, I purposefully made the decision not to dive into the actual production of the bomb for this episode. I think that's probably best saved for a future episode about the Manhattan Project, sort of as a whole. But instead, today, what I want to focus on is the Trinity test itself. And remember, I really do think history is best learned through empathy. So I think the best way to gain that empathy, like I said earlier, is to look at the quotes from the people who witnessed these events and were alive at this time. So this is some of the Trinity test in the words of those who witnessed it firsthand. Quote, the lightning effects beggared description. The whole country was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun. It was golden, purple, violet, gray, and blue. It lighted every peak, crevasse, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described but must be seen to be imagined. This was the description of the blast that was given by Major General Thomas Farrell in his official report. Now, William L. Lawrence of the New York Times described the scene in the following way, and I think this is really interesting. Quote, a loud cry filled the air. The little groups that so far had stood rooted to the earth like desert plants broke into dance. The rhythm of primitive man dancing at one of his fire festivals at the coming of the spring. And I think that quote is so interesting because it really does speak to the fact that while the creation of these weapons seems to be such a terrible, terrible thing because of all the death and destruction that they end up causing, you also have to put yourself in the shoes of the scientists that are working to develop these weapons and understand that they are in a race with the Nazis to develop these weapons. And essentially, on the day of the Trinity test, they get the confirmation that they have won the race. And that's where that celebration comes from. And while I think we would all like to imagine that everything about the Trinity test was sort of a somber reflection on what they had created, the reality is at the end of the day, they believed that they were in a very, very dangerous, very competitive race to figure out how to make these weapons. And to be honest, I really think if you take that approach of trying to put yourself in their shoes, you can absolutely understand why they would have the celebration that they had. And I think that William Lawrence does a great job of describing it in this way through this quote. So I just find that very interesting. But I actually find the poignant nature of Robert Oppenheimer's description a few years later to be the most insightful. It's by far my favorite quote from World War II, to be honest. So he says, quote, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that, one way or another." And I find it interesting because it speaks to that fact that the scientists and the military personnel knew what they saw and they knew what it meant. And ultimately, I think most importantly, what they knew was what these weapons would be used for. And yet, the horror of those sentiments seems to have only been made bearable by this sobering reminder that this was ultimately the only choice left that they could make given the circumstances.